Yes. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about what people have been dealing with in this pandemic. And there are both some positives and some negatives. The negatives, I think, are fairly obvious, that people all over the place have been anxious, anxious about their safety, anxious about the safety of others, anxious about being away from familiarity and being disconnected from other people in their lives, particularly people in school, and a feeling that they can't do anything very much because what's happened has been out of their control. Some of our young people have been possibly living in difficult, stressful environments without the usual support that they're used to in school. So when they come back to school, I think there's an expectation that some of those kids will be stressed, and that will exhibit itself in their behaviour. But there are also other young people who've had some real positive lockdown experiences. There's been less pressure on them, they spend more time with their family, there's been more opportunities for creativity. And I think that one of those results of that is that it's a learning experience about what is actually well-being if some people are really flourishing in a time of difficulty because of some of the things that have happened at home. But of course, a lot of people will want to return to what's familiar. I'm going to spend most of today talking about the Aspire principles. And this is a framework of for practice, but it's also a pedagogy for social emotional learning. Young people certainly need to learn skills and knowledge for resilience and relationships, but they also need to understand about their perceptions of other people, what underpins their attitudes. So it's not just about learning skills, it's about connecting with each other in the learning of those skills. For me, there's been a big focus, and the reason I developed Aspire in the first place is because it's not just what you do, but how you do it. There was a concern in the UK about the SEAL programme, which was the social emotional learning programme, that it wasn't a safe place for teachers or for students. And I think that although the writers of that critique threw the baby out with the bathwater, I think they had a point. And I think that what we've done here is develop a set of principles that are workable in practice and are safe and supportive. Have a quick look at that infographic. And it represents two extremes of a classroom. And the first one is kids completely out of control. And the second one is full teacher control and kids sitting and doing as they're told. And the first letter in Aspire is agency. And what we have at the moment in many places is a mantra that says that a good teacher is one who is in control. And although I think it's absolutely critical that teachers are in charge of their classes and not letting chaos reign and having clear expectations, that does not mean controlling students. Because a controlling relationship is not a healthy relationship. It undermines protective factors for those youngsters who are in difficult circumstances at home. It doesn't model good relational skills. And for younger children, it leads to anxiety, high levels of anxiety. And for older children, it might lead to rebellion and anger. And if somebody is controlling you all the time, it reduces the chances of self-control. And those people who feel very controlled by others feel that it's all right to blame others when things don't go well for them, when things go wrong. So it's power over rather than power with. And what we are going to be looking at in agency is the opposite of that, power with students rather than power over them. And I think it's worth reminding everyone here that teacher-student relationships are critical to the quality of learning and a major factor in resilience. Possibly the most important factor is having someone who rates you, somebody who believes in you, someone who thinks you're worthwhile. There's a huge body of evidence now, and I've just cited a few people there, on the importance of self-determination for well-being, for motivation, and for optional functioning. And that means the importance of actually giving young people a voice. Pupils need to have a stake in their own learning. They need to be able to make decisions about what concerns them. And when they take responsibility, then it's harder for them to blame other people when things go wrong. So what's happened in the pandemic, as I've already said, is that some students will feel that everything's been out of their control. And what they need to have back is a sense of control and given some choices and handed responsibility. And there's just a few ideas about how you might do that. I don't think it's a very good idea to impose rules on students. When I worked in a school in the Melbourne area at one time, I was doing some circle training, and the head teacher said to me, "I hope you don't mind, Sue, but we don't have rules in this school. Everything is run around values." And I think that was a really good reminder for me that if students actually develop their own guidelines, they're much more likely to abide by them. And another teacher told me at one point that he'd put a whole load of values words around his classroom and got the children at the beginning of the year to vote for the values that they wanted to see in their schools. A Socratic approach is where you ask good questions rather than actually telling children what to think. Sometimes things need to be didactic, but actually asking questions gives children agency. And if a youngster is behaving in a way that's difficult and says, "You can't make me," just agree with them. And tell them what the outcomes of different decisions will be, but you can't make them. So in social emotional learning, what does agency mean? First of all, that it's not about telling them what to think. It's about giving them activities in which they are encouraged to think about issues, talk about those issues together, and come to their own conclusions. If we tell them, then it's not, in the end, their ideas and their identity. Over the pandemic, we have had real concerns, I think in Australia and in the UK, about concerns about male violence. And one of the examples of agency in practice that I've given in the Circle Solutions for Student Wellbeing, which is the 3rd edition of the book that came out in March, is an activity called Growing Good Men. And it just asks boys to talk about and think about what it means to be a real man and how they got to those ideas, and then what it means to be a good man and how they're influenced to think about that. And what do they want to be seen as? Where do they want to go? Who do they want to be? We need to get young people to think about who they want to be. The second acronym in Aspire is safety. And we know that young people who don't feel safe in school, either physically or emotionally, find it much harder to focus and learn. So what does safety mean? Safety means being accepted for who you are, from wherever you come from, and being valued. And I think that one of the things that we need to think about, particularly in the recent events in the US, is a real active focus on celebrating and understanding diversity and valuing each person for everything that they bring to the table, and knowing that we need difference. We don't need homogeneity. We don't need everyone to be the same. Safety also means not being judged because you're in any way different, not being blamed when it might be an accident or you might be part of a group who've caused a problem, and never ever being belittled. And I'm sure that all of the people who are on this webinar this morning would not consider belittling children, because you have been learning so clearly what brings them well-being. It also means being able to make mistakes. There's a lot of research that says that making mistakes enables people to actually have a growth mindset and be able to carry on learning. And I think safety is also about not always being in competition with other people, but being able to see that you can make progress yourself, not in a competitive climate. So what about safety in social and emotional learning? One of the things that's come out clearly in the work that I've done is that young people don't always feel comfortable in speaking out. Good. So it's important that they have the option to stay silent if they want to. They don't have to say anything. And one of no put downs is one of the 3 guidelines, that people can say personal positives to each other, but they can't put people down either in what they say or in the expressions on their faces. It's important that students only talk about issues that concern them. And that's not, circles, social and emotional learning is not the place to talk about incidents that have happened. Somebody told me once that they had a problem in after school, a racist problem after school, and that they'd had a circle afterwards. And I was a bit shocked about that, because I thought, well, you know, that is going to involve people being named and shamed. And they said, no, we didn't do any of that. We just talked about the issues that were involved in that incident. I have also put an emphasis on the third person rather than the first. And that limits people feeling that they have to talk about themselves. So if you say, it would make someone happy when, or it would make someone sad if, then they might be talking about their own experiences, but it's not direct, and it makes it safer for people. Even the positives can actually expose people in a way that they don't want to be. So that's another way of promoting some safety. The third of the Aspire principles is positivity. And a lot of my work now is based in the world of positive psychology and in community psychology. And we know from Barbara Fredrickson's work that positive emotions open up cognitive pathways. If you imagine coming into school when you have seen an accident possibly happen, and you are full of anxiety and fear, and then somebody asks you to make a decision about something, it's very hard for you to think straight. So it's only when you're feeling calmer and more together does your brain suddenly go into action, and you can have some constructive thinking. So promoting positive emotions seems to make a lot of sense to me as to how well-being can be facilitated, positive relationships can be facilitated in the classroom. And we know that some of our young people come into school with a whole load of negative feelings. So how can we change the balance? There's so many positive emotions, and I'm sure that many of you will be able to think of dozens yourselves, but this was just one that I came up with in just a minute when I was working on the presentation. The importance of feeling comfortable. feeling calm enough to learn, having some optimism and feeling hopeful. It's so important that you feel that you're cared for, that you're organised. And lots of kids get into a lot of struggle because they're not organised, and then things sometimes go to bad for worse for them. That you feel heard, that your views are taken into account, and that also that you can achieve, even if that's in little steps. The language that we use in school, as you will know, really matters. And that's not only about how we talk to people, but it's also about how we talk about people. And language, conversations, create a culture in a school. I did some research in Australia, and one teacher sat next to me and said, do you know, she said, it's not seen as cool in this school to speak badly about any of the students. And she says it just changes dialogue everywhere. And I said, well, what happens if somebody comes and it's a support teacher or a casual teacher and they say something negative about one of your students? And she says, well, we'll just offer them an alternative view of that student, or we'll say that they're having a bit of a tough time. Don't get into confrontation, she says, but we want to maintain the culture that we've developed here. Talking about what kids can't do and how awful they are is the absolute opposite of strengths and solution-focused language. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a minute more about the importance of that. But the British Psychological Society has just released a paper about the importance of what schools and teachers need to know when kids go back to school. They were supposed to go back to school in years reception 1 and 6 this week, although quite a lot of people are choosing not to because they don't think it's safe yet. But they talked about how important it is to play and the importance of play. So the British Psychological Society have put play high on the agenda. And we know that some of our kids come to school, look forward to coming to school because that's where they have the most fun, and they will have missed that. And there are going to be some families where there's been an enormous amount of stress and concern and even illness. And it's important that they have an alternative way of interacting with each other. We should never underestimate the value of play. It's where children will learn a lot of social and emotional skills and understanding. And laughing together boosts oxytocin. Oxytocin is the feel-good transmitter. It's involved in a lot of reproductive functions, but also in laughing together and in hugs, and it promotes trust, collaboration, resilience. I know that hugs is going to be a bit of a difficult one for people because of the need to stay apart. And I think that we're going to need to think very clearly about at what point, if somebody comes to you for a hug, you accept that rather than reject it. One school I worked in the UK recently has got a safe touch policy, and I think that needs to be in every school. Another important positive function is about our inner discourse. And so much of our well-being is based in the inner conversations that we have. And helping young people become aware of positive and negative thinking is valuable. Lots of us will know that CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, is based in the idea that some thinking is helpful and some thinking is unhelpful. And I'm not going to go into this in any details, but we've developed, with a little bit of seeding money from the RSA, the Royal Society of Arts, some stories, 6 stories that have put positive and negative thinking into characters, and that's for children aged 8 to 11. and each come with a teacher and a family toolkit. So how about positivity in social and emotional learning? Well, along with the mantra that playing is good for us all, activities are often presented as games. And one of the things that young people say in feedback about the social and emotional learning using the Aspire principles, which of course I use in Circle Solutions, is that it's fun, and what they love is that they have fun together. And I've already mentioned the importance of discussing issues and not incidents, and all of the promoting of positive emotions, but also looking at solutions. What do we want, not what do we want to get rid of? How do we develop a safe and happy class? Giving youngsters activities that enable them to talk about what they want to see in their classes, what they want to have in their relationships with each other, how they can support each other to feel included. And then, of course, many of those strengths activities, identifying strengths not just for ourselves and each other, but also our strengths for different situations. What strengths do young people need when they're coming back into school? What strengths do they need to stay resilient? What strengths do they need if they've got a piece of presentation to do? These are another resource that is about strengths in circles, and each what is in there is each of the Aspire principles has 7 statements for young people to discuss together. So in the inclusion principle, one of them is we are strong together. So we would ask young people to say, in what ways is that true? In another one is we are kind in what we say and do. And they might be asked to say, how do we know that's happening in our class? How can we see it? What can we hear? How can we do more of this? So there are 7 statements for each of the Aspire principles. The next of the Aspire principles is inclusion. And we know just how important a sense of belonging is. It's one of the strongest factors for well-being. The fact that it's in the resilience research, it's in the behaviour research, and it's also in prevention of violence research. It is such an important principle for all of us to be taking note of. We know that feeling rejected by others, and it doesn't even have to be others in your group, but feeling rejected can cause emotional pain that is matched by physical pain. It can be very, very hard to take, and it has long-term impact. We know that youngsters who've been bullied have mental health difficulties sometimes well into adulthood. But I want to talk about 2 different sorts of belonging, because I think that this is not often talked about. Exclusive belonging is really good for those people who are inside the bubble of exclusive belonging. It's me and my gang. And what actually happens there is that those who are not like me and not conforming to what my particular group of people are doing are seen as inferior, which isn't helpful. In very extreme circumstances, exclusive belonging can be at the crux of racism, sexism, and homophobia. So sometimes people promote exclusive belonging with the view that this is very important, but actually there's an element in there which says that other people are a bit inferior to us, and that has implications on a long-term basis. So what I'm saying here is that however important belonging is, it has to be inclusive belonging. People need to be actively accepted for who they are. We need to welcome those who are different and position difference as something valuable, both in our culture, in our curriculum, and in our society. I've just read a really nice paper by Isaac Prilatensky, who talks about the issue of mattering. And I think mattering comes into the whole scenario of inclusive belonging. And he says that people feel they matter when two things happen. It's not just about being welcomed and acknowledged and respected and recognised. It's also being able to add value, to see and to feel that you too can contribute, that participation isn't in name only, but you're given a role, you have a way of making yourself matter. So I think that throws up questions for schools about not just how people treat you, but about what you can do to include and participate. So what does that mean for youngsters who have special educational needs of some sort or another, who often are recipients of a lot of support, but are we also giving them a way of contributing that makes them feel that they matter? So what happens in inclusion in social and emotional learning? And for me, this is just so critically important. We mix everybody up all the time, usually in a game, so that they talk with others who aren't in their usual social circles, and they get to know other people. And you do that all the time. So that you stop having cliques in your classes. It's harder to bully someone when you actually not only know them, but you found something about them that is that you have in common with them. These quotes are from a recent evaluation, and one youngster, this was in years 5 and 6, finding out more about people makes us better friends. And I mostly enjoyed when we were working in partners to achieve a thing with the whole class. Not only are people working in small groups, but they're also working, interviewing people, finding out about them. They're given a structured question and they find out about each other. And then they find out what they have in common. And for me, it's incredibly important that it's not just about social and emotional learning, it's not just about skill development, but it's about actually discovering our shared humanity, what we have in common and what we need to do to ensure that everybody feels that they are important and that they are valued, and that we do not stereotype people and we do not, which leads to prejudice. And I think that all of us will be very aware of what we've just been seeing happening in the States and the ongoing prejudice that's abounding there. And I think unless we address that in schools in a very major way, then in the end, it's not going to resolve itself. People need to be educated into shared humanity and out of prejudice. Respect is not easily defined. This is the R in aspire, and it sometimes means deference to authority, probably less so than it used to. And unfortunately, we do not have as many good role models for respect as maybe we need. I can remember being in Australia on Harmony Day and being invited onto the stage while a group of girls, many of them Aboriginal, were presenting to the rest of the school. And I was sitting next to a politician who shall remain nameless. And this person tried to engage me in front of the whole school, because we were sitting at the back of the stage, tried to engage me in conversation. the whole time that the young people were presenting. And I did not respond because I felt at the time that it was utterly disrespectful to those young people who planned and prepared and had probably put a lot of effort into the presentation that they were giving to the whole school. So I think we need to think very hard about giving our youngsters good role models for respect. Respect for individuals means not jumping to conclusions about who they are, and being considerate of what's happening for them, which means not imposing us. I think sometimes in meetings it's easy to put what matters to us first without asking good questions. And for me, it's also about respect for culture. If we don't do that, if we don't all become acculturated, if we don't know about the culture of the youngsters that we're teaching and finding out what's really important to them, then we are doing them a disservice and we're not respecting them. And I think it's just worth saying here that it's not a competition about whose culture is most important and whose culture has precedence. There is room for all of us. And I think in a way it reminds me of, you know, having my second child a long time ago now, is that I wondered, I had so much love for my first one. I thought, will there be enough for a second one? And yes, of course, love grows and so does respect. It's not limited. Respectful listen is also important to do, but I think we need to find ways of doing that, because if some youngsters come up to us and they need to talk, sometimes it's not an appropriate time. But I think just saying, can you talk to me about this later, is respectful without putting them to one side. There are many messages that is easily given about whether or not we respect culture or other people, and very largely it's not about giving messages about our power and authority. I, as an educational psychologist, was once in a meeting with, this is in England, not in Australia, with a head teacher who sat behind her desk on a platform in her room and literally looked down to the parents and the educational psychologists who were sitting in the comfy chairs below. And what I felt very strongly then was this was a message about who was most important there. I've done, as many of you will know, a good deal of work with Aboriginal girls and in the Aboriginal Girls Circle. And one of the things we asked them to do was to do a collage in small groups about how they wanted to see their future communities. And this is one of them. And as you can see, respect features very highly in that. So what about respect in social emotional learning? And one of the 3 guidelines is that when one person is speaking, everybody else listens. And what teachers tell me is that this has generalised into classroom behaviour, and people have actually learned to listen to each other. It's very easy not to listen properly, which means that we interrupt, we say what's in our minds, we have conversations that are side conversations rather than actually paying attention to the person who's at the moment got the talking stick, the person who is actually speaking at the time. The showing consideration, I mean, I think also includes not going on for too long so that the airspace is shared. That is actually one of the things around consideration. Respect is also about acknowledgement. And somebody told me in a teacher wellbeing conference that I went to that the only time senior management had actually spoken to them was when they thought that they were doing something wrong. She says, I do my very best for my students. She said that of all the things I do all the time, she said, there's never been any acknowledgement for the positives, only acknowledgement for when I don't do things absolutely up to scratch. And I think that that's important for all of us. We need to be aware of what the effort that people are in and acknowledge that. Also, respect in SEL is about contextual awareness, which actually is aware of different people's circumstances. And an example of that is not using the phrase, maybe in a sentence completion, my best friend, when you have people in there who have social difficulties. Because I have heard of one person, one youngster who was on the spectrum, who had done really, really well with friendship, and she was able to name someone who was a good friend, but nobody named her. And just having that activity actually destroyed social emotional learning in that class for a while, because she was desperately upset and had a meltdown. And it would have been easier just to say, a good friend is someone who, and that actually shows contextual awareness. It also is about safety and not using I, or using I as little as possible. And I've already mentioned the importance of having cultural awareness. Now, there is a lot, and this is the last of the Aspire principles. There is a great deal of literature on the importance of equality in well-being across nations. Denmark has the least gap between the haves and the have-nots. They have most trust in their politicians, and they have high levels of well-being and happiness, and that's been around for a long time. Wilkinson and Pickett wrote a great deal in their book, The Spirit Level, about the importance of equality for well-being everywhere. And when I first did Aspire, the E in Aspire was for equality, but I've changed that to equity, because treating everyone exactly the same and having homogeneity does not respect diversity, and it leads to what isn't fair. And what we need is flexibility and adaptation in order to ensure that everyone has the same opportunity. And I'm sure many of you will have actually seen this cartoon. And I note that in that examination, the monkey is full of positive emotions. He can smile because he knows that he can pass this, that he can do it. But I don't expect the fishes smiling. It's very difficult to actually have fairness if you have homogeneic equality. And I want to thank Beth Stanley, who's done a lot of work for the wellbeing stories, for other things that I've done, to show the difference between equality and equity. And this is equality. Everybody is standing on the same sized box to look at the football match that's going on. And one of those little ones is asking what's happening, because she doesn't have the same access to the football match or to seeing it as the other two do. This is equity, where you actually make sure that you put the blocks in place that enable people to have the same opportunities, watching the same football match. So what about equity in social emotional learning? Because it's not just about skills, but it's about perceptions and understanding, not just of yourself, but of others. SEL needs to be a universal intervention. It needs to be for everyone. We know that if social skills training happens for targeted groups, they will learn some skills. But when they go back into the classroom, nobody else has understood that those people are any different. And what happens is that they reinforce earlier behaviours so that that learning, that social emotional learning, is not sustained. Social emotional learning needs to be for everyone. It's important that everyone has the opportunity to participate. So there needs to be that flexibility built in. And I can remember going to see a circle taking place in a school. It's in the ACT. And there was one girl there who'd had a lot of struggles with her life in general. And she was allowed to just come into the circle and maybe out of it from time to time, join in with some of the activities, but not all of them. She wasn't disruptive, which would have been more difficult, but she was allowed to just wander in and out because she needed that, and everybody accepted it. It's not about saying you've got to sit down and be quiet and join in, when it was so much more difficult for her. And in the same school, I also participated in another circle, and there was a boy there who'd been told that he could he also had been struggling with some difficulties. He had been diagnosed as on the autistic spectrum, and he had been given things to do, but told he could join in when he felt that he could abide by the guidelines, because abiding by the guidelines, those 3 simple guidelines, that you may pass, that you listen when one person is speaking, and you don't put people down, just the 3 guidelines, that he could join in if he could abide by them. And when the first activity started, he jumped up from the work he was doing outside the circle and said, "Oh, I like this." And he chose, again, agency, he chose to join in. And in fact, he stayed for the whole of the circle and was engaged in all the activities. What happens with equity, the framework means that quiet students develop confidence to speak. And it's harder for the loud students to become dominant. And I know that where circles have been happening in schools, circle solutions have been happening in schools, they have taken on this framework, the Aspire framework, not necessarily in a circle, but they've taken on the Aspire framework into staff meetings. And people have told me that it has totally changed the dynamic, because everybody feels that they have a voice, and that mixes people up. So other people talk to each other. And it stops just 1 or 2 voices being dominant, which of course is so important. You can still work in small groups, but the idea of having a circle puts everybody on the same level. And I think it's the most important aspect of social and emotional learning in Aspire with equity, is that the facilitator, the teacher, does everything the students do. They don't stand and deliver, they don't stand to one side, they get engaged. They do the pair shares, they do the paired interviews. And what happens is that they change their relationships with their class, because they get to know students in a way that they wouldn't ever otherwise have known. It changes relationships, and it changes relationships for the better. There are a few people I know who have chosen on the aim of equity to be known by their first name in social and emotional learning in circles, because he says they put them on the same level, and students don't take advantage. They call them Miss or Mr. outside of the circle, but they're known by their first name in the circle. It's just an indicator. Now I've come to the end of this. I think I rushed through the first bit because I was a bit worried about getting through it all in just an hour. But I think if anybody has any questions, it's been a bit hard actually seeing everybody come in, and I'm sorry if some people have missed out on that. I did let people in when I saw them. But if anybody's got any questions, you can certainly get more information. The book I mentioned, that was published in March, is now in its 3rd edition, and it has a whole chapter on, and of course lots and lots of activities. And those are a couple of websites you might be interested in Growing Great Schools Worldwide, which is my organisation, and the Wellbeing Stories.
I'd just like to raise a question with you and perhaps get your thoughts on, as students are transitioning back onto school sites and face-to-face learning, some of the key considerations around establishing that sense of safety for young people. Your thoughts on that?
I think that one of the things that I think is quite important is that there needs to be some clear guidelines so that they know what to do around the whole of the safe hand washing, the safe distancing. And the feedback that I'm getting is that once they know clearly what to do, students are quite able to do that. So that's one way of promoting safety. I think that anxiety has been in a way heightened in environments where people are talking about the worries all the time. So I think a focus on what is working well, a focus on play and enjoyment and inclusion will actually help students feel safer, because it takes their focus away from some of the conversations around potential danger. I think there's probably other people who've got other things that they might want to add to that. I think teachers as well. I mean, a lot of teachers have felt a bit anxious about coming back. And teacher wellbeing has to be centre stage as well as student wellbeing. If students are going to be anxious and not feel safe about, having missed out on the curriculum, we need to put the curriculum just slightly to one side at the moment, because wellbeing needs to be centre stage. Relationships between people are now probably most important, and young people need to have opportunities to talk with each other about what helps keep them feeling okay about things. And that's one of the things that's great about social emotional learning, giving them the opportunities to actually talk about, what cheers you up when you feel down, what makes you feel safe, what would you like the school to do? Giving them the agency, asking them the good questions. They've got plenty of ideas. And sometimes we sort of say that we know best. Ask the kids, ask them.
Sue, could I ask a question, if you don't mind, from what I've heard of you so far, and what you when it comes to school environments and teachers and adults, and what you've described and talked through today, does every adult and every teacher have to be expert at this and have to be specialist at it? Does it require that all the time for it to be successful, do you think?
Social emotional learning are you talking about, or the Aspire?
Yes, social emotional learning. Does it always require experts and specialists, and you have to be explicit, and if you haven't got that, well, your results don't follow? Or
my view, very, very clearly about this, is that social and emotional learning needs, wherever possible, needs to take place with teachers who see the students on a regular basis, because it is not a standalone activity that happens for part of the week. Social and emotional learning needs to be threaded through everything that happens in a school, in the same way as well-being is threaded through everything that happens in a school. It's how you talk to each other. It's how you reinforce kindness. It's how you give space for people to speak and listen to each other. And I think that if people actually have some even brief understanding of the Aspire principles, then they've got some sort of framework on which to build. There's lots more that can be detailed in that framework. But I think it's important that people know a little bit about how to do what they're doing, rather than just taking sort of ideas, from a book. I think the how is the most important, but it's also the reinforcing of it on a daily basis. It's critical. It's relationships, resilience, responsibility. It's critical. It's how we talk to each other. It's how we are with each other. It's the culture that we develop. And we are all, and I think this is worth saying, we are all in the situation of becoming. We're all learning. None of us is going to be a complete expert on anything, really. There's still more to learn all the time. There's more information, there's more research, there's more things coming through. That answer your question, Dennis?
Yes, yes, it certainly does. Thank you, Sue.
Somebody's asked a question, what strategies do we need to think about in the process of now in the terms of head or even next year? Strategies for me is a bit of a difficult word, because it's, in order to think about a strategy, you need to be thinking about the context and the culture in which a strategy is embedded, to make sure that anything that you are doing is embedded in what we know is effective in well-being. But I also think that for me, particularly just what's happened with the difficulties around the pandemic, is that some of our young people are going to be struggling more than they have been in a number of ways. And what we need to have is a way of responding to those youngsters who might have experienced trauma or violence in the home, I mean, all sorts of things.
Sue, that question was from me.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about staff. So we've all done this amazing time and we've all got through it, but you know, it's just the unpacking of it or the processing of it as we move forward, just with our well-being protective factors, just for the staff, just the processing of it, because we've all done an amazing job, but how do we protect the wheels coming off as we go forward? Do you understand? I don't know whether I'm making myself clear or not.
I think that, yes, and I'm sorry to misunderstand the question. And to some extent, the same things apply. It's about actually supporting each other in acknowledging what you have already done, what you have achieved, what you have managed, how you have got through this, talking to each other about what helped you get through this, and thinking about the future as you go forward, actually also having the courage to remember what worked and remember what both you and the children that you teach have learned from this pandemic. We've learned so much from it. Teacher well-being is absolutely so critical. If we don't, if we want to nourish our students, we need to cherish our teachers, and teachers need to be able to cherish each other. You need to stay well, which means that you need to stay connected in some way. You need to be clear about what you can and can't do, and knowing that you can't be all things to all people all the time and do everything to the best of your, to a stage of excellence at all times. I think if we remember that trying to do everything to the best of our ability will not help our future sanity is an important thing to remember. So it's about looking at priorities and focusing on those priorities and focusing on what is in your control and not getting lost in what is out of your control and things that you cannot change, because you can use up emotional energy on that. And I think we need to be careful about what we use up our emotional as well as our physical energy on, and who is supporting your emotional energy. You know, with your colleagues, the things that maybe that you read, the people at home.
No, thank you. That's lots to think about. Thank you, Sue, very much.
Welcome. Some people now who are beginning to leave, because for you it's 5 o'clock and for me it's breakfast time. Thank you very much for having me here. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm wishing you all well in the times ahead. And thank you again for everything that you do, everything that you are doing, both for your students and for each other.
No, that's great. Thank you very much, Sue. I'd just like to, before we wrap up, just to sincerely acknowledge what you've presented and shared to us today. You've given us a lot of food for thought at this time, particularly in relation to social and emotional learning and the Aspire framework, to inform our thinking as our schools and our leaders and our student wellbeing leaders are half in school and half out of school, doing remote learning, working through adjustments, getting to go back further to all our schools as of next Tuesday. So thank you for what you shared today in the latest of our rolling series of webinars. We really appreciate your expertise and your response to our request at short notice. So we are very appreciative of that from the Student Wellbeing Unit and Catholic Education Melbourne. And we look forward to working with you in new ways again in the time ahead. And I'd also like to thank all the participants online today as well. So who've taken the time, given up their time now. I know it's late in the day and it's been a long slog of term 2 already. Totally uncharted waters. So thank you for your late afternoon efforts. And to you, Sue, we'll let you get on with your day and to enjoy your breakfast. So thank you for your expertise before breakfast over there.
Thank you. I'm getting
Good afternoon, everybody.